So what is this one day? I submit to you that since Jesus came over 2,000 years ago, Saturdays have always been a day of rest. Universally, you can go anywhere from Africa to China and say to them, what does Saturday mean to you? And most people in the Christian world will say, well, that's the day. It's, I know I have to do, but I love Saturdays. It's when I get out the barbecue, it's the football game, it's the family function, it's the picnic. The mindset since Jesus came is that is a day of rest. But Sunday? The Lord's Day? So what is this one day? If we analyze what took place at the empty tomb, this one day is a day of worship. It's a day of worship, my friends. It's when we come to worship the Lord together. It's a day of remembrance. The Lord's Day is a day of remembrance. This past week, we celebrated Martin Luther King Day, last Monday. I've had the privilege of being the preacher for Martin Luther King Days in this nation. Los Angeles, in New York, here in our own city, I've been invited. I personally think Dr. Martin Luther King was an extraordinary human being. And this nation determined that on Martin Luther King Day, this whole nation would commemorate that day. The newspapers carry articles. The president speaks about him in his inaugural address. There's a magnificent statue that has been erected in his honor in Washington. There are services and meetings and gatherings all across this nation commemorating a man who did something. He effected change. He brought a people along. He helped a culture to change their attitude toward the things that we struggle with most. And if we once a year will go to such lengths to remember a great man like Dr. Martin Luther King, how much more ought we not to remember this Jesus? Memorial Day. You want me to begin weeping, I start talking about veterans, men and women in uniform. I love it. I eat it up. I read about all the epic battles from the Pacific to the Atlantic, to the European theater, to our men and women in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I weep and I think of the great sacrifices. And I know that on Veterans Day and Memorial Day and other days, we fly the flag and we stand and we salute and we thank them and we have honor gods. How much more do we not understand that God said on one day, remember me? It's a day of worship and a day of remembrance. It's a day of witness. They went out and they told their friends. How many of us are telling our friends and bringing them to church with us to come and see? It's a day of giving. This day, the Lord's Day, is a day of giving. They came prepared to anoint him. It's a day of identification. It's the day when we gather together as believers in churches of every shape and every size, in front of television sets and in bar rooms and under trees in Africa and in India, and we identify ourselves with the risen Savior. We say to one another, because he's alive, I am alive. That's me. It's a day of instruction. Jesus taught them from the moment they realized who he was. Don't give me this booey-hooey about you can learn all about him when you're on the golf course, because you don't. That's why God has given us pastors and teachers. That's why we have parents. That's why we have discipleship leaders. That's why we have people who are there. God has given to them the giftedness of being able to pass on and to shepherd the flock. And that's exactly what God had in mind. And he said, at least one day you need to come together and you need to receive instruction from me. But most of all, number 7, it's a day for every day. Let it be heard from this pulpit that Jesus in no way even suggested that worship and remembrance and witness and giving and identification and instruction ought to be limited just to the Lord's Day. That's why in the book of Acts in chapter 2 and verse 46, the word that we find here is day by day they met together, receiving the apostles' instructions. Day by day they gathered together to pray. Day by day they gathered. It's a daily experience. The Lord's Day is every day. There's never a time that we ought not to be worshiping him. But that old adage that you hear in every community, well, you know, people are busy and I worship the Lord all the time. And, you know, everywhere I am, I'm in an attitude of prayer. Of course you are. And of course we must be. But this is a special time, my friends. Because God said it.